Okay, does this work? Yes. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Sorry for the delay. I was still had to answer difficult questions about nature positive insurance. And thematically, we'll continue with this session talking about finance solutions for nature and biodiversity risks. This is a really relatively new topic, I think, for probably most of the world, apart from some ecologists and especially finance institutions. But I want to give a very brief introduction to the topic and then invite our speakers up on stage. So, as you probably all know, the businesses that we finance, invest in, and insure depend on nature and biodiversity. And you always hear, big numbers. At least half of global GDP is dependent on nature. I say that's incorrect. I think 100%. Is actually dependent on nature, and our survival is dependent on healthy nature. So, the world ocean, forests, rivers, lands provide most of the raw materials, goods, services which underpin the global economy. But as you know, and I promise I won't talk too much about the doom and gloom, but human impacts have really caused massive issues. There's a lot of exploitation of species and habitats, and they're causing what many believe to be the sixth mass extinction event in the history of our planet. And there's an infamous UN report from 2019 that warns that at least 1 million species are at the risk of extinction, with many ecosystems at the brink of collapse, including many marine spaces, but also the Amazon rainforest, for example. And of course, humanity needs natural ecosystems to be functioning in order to survive. And there was some light at the end of the tunnel last year when the Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as the High Seas Treaty, were agreed. And humanity really commits with these two treaties to changing harmful economic activities toward a nature-positive future, alongside protecting at least 30% of land and ocean by 2030. Now, the big question is, of course, how can financial actors start integrating nature into their financial decision-making, lower their exposure to biodiversity risk on land and sea, and develop innovative solutions to support this urgent transition? And at UNEP FI, we have a work stream on nature that I'm the associate lead of, and we are really trying to answer exactly these questions and try to support banks, investors, and insurers on their journey toward including nature across their lines of business. And among other topics, we focus on the ocean as one big field, convening a community of practice of now almost 90 institutions around the sustainable blue economy finance principles that are the world's gold standard, really, to aligning financial activity with SDG 14, life below water. And as part of that work, we also convene a collaborative engagement process on sustainable seafood currently until next year, as well as we've just in the final throes of developing global guidance on how to issue blue bonds under the green bond principles of ICMA, and that is meant to be out this summer, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Alongside that, we are also co-founders of the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosures, or TNFD, a market-led initiative looking to develop a framework for reporting on nature-related risks and impacts. And as part of our extended work with financial institutions, we also have a focus on food systems, addressing the interlinkages of the food and agriculture sectors with biodiversity and climate topics as part of the Good Food Finance Network. And we convene, in addition to that, working groups for banks specifically to build capacity to set targets on biodiversity. And we just suggested a similar approach for insurers, so I'm hoping that will happen soon. And I think capacity building is one of the big topics on this theme. But to learn more about what's being done on the ground, we'll hear from three excellent speakers today, and I want to extend a very warm welcome to Louise Heaps, who is the head of Sustainable Blue Economy at WWF, Roland Hunter, the Senior Sourcing Manager, Africa and Nature-Based Solutions at South Pole, as well as Kelvin Massingham, who's the Director, Risk and Resilience at FSD Africa. Please join me up on stage. You all have your mics. We might have to share some of them. Or if you want a mic up us, or we can share. I think it's okay. Don't worry. And I don't have a timer here. Does that mean I have unlimited time? That's super. Thank you. Perfect. Okay. So I'd like to dive right in because I do know that I think we have until 5:30. So let's get right to the gist of it. And I'll single out Louise first by asking about nature-based solutions. I'm sure you all have heard about this topic. And what do you think? What role can nature-based solutions play in contributing to the global biodiversity framework, alongside also the Paris Agreement?
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm really going to be focusing on the oceans here because that is where my expertise lies. And with that in mind, I thought it might be just useful to talk a little bit about the economic importance of the ocean, in fact, and the fact that it provides many ecosystem services which support humanity, including keeping our climate in balance, providing a vital source of oxygen, providing natural infrastructure that protects coastal populations and cities from the impacts of severe weather events, and it helps to feed a growing population and supports hundreds of millions of livelihoods. And in fact, WWF back in 2015 did an assessment of the value of the natural assets of the ocean and calculated them to be worth something like $24 trillion, releasing benefits of up to $2.5 trillion per annum. And by way of example, coral reefs, which were mentioned in the last session, only occupied 0.1% of the ocean floor, but they contribute significantly to the economy of many developing countries. They also provide essential habitat for 25% of the world's marine species. And in fact, coral reefs alone generate $36 billion per annum for global tourism. But most significantly, the ocean has been a massive buffer to the impacts of climate change. I think we've heard that a few times today, and have probably sequestered around a third of carbon dioxide since that's been produced by anthropogenic means since the Industrial Revolution. And habitats such as salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass beds, kelp forests all can store up to 5 times more carbon dioxide, in fact, than the terrestrial habitats or terrestrial equivalents. And these habitats have an absolutely crucial role, as I said earlier, in actually protecting our coastlines, and therefore, in fact, I just want to focus specifically on mangroves, which there's been a calculation that mangroves restoration alone could actually save $65 billion per year in terms of otherwise potential losses to the economy if they were removed. And in fact, 100 to 300 million people are at risk of flooding if we continue with business as usual practices and removing and degrading the habitats as we are today. The Earth Security Group also did an interesting study recently and actually looked at a renewable energy plant in Pakistan and found that by rehabilitating mangroves around that renewable energy plant, that the plant was actually saved around $7 million as a result of protecting that plant from the impacts and ravages of weather events. So as such, healthy and intact ocean and coastal ecosystems are really the foundation of a sustainable blue economy. But as we know, the science is really telling us now that we do have a biodiversity and a climate crisis in our ocean. And this is being further exacerbated by unprecedented development in an already damaged ocean and damaged coastal ecosystems. And in fact, the OECD have actually predicted that there's going to be a doubling of the ocean economy during this decade. And climate change in particular, as we know, is having one of the most pervasive impacts on the ocean. And I just mentioned coral reefs earlier. We've now lost 50% of our coral reefs over the last 30 years as a result of climate change and other forms of damage. And it's possible that we could potentially lose most of our coral reefs by 2050 if we carry on with this trajectory. So the climate and biodiversity crisis is really leading us all towards a very high-risk environment, not least because it's affecting our ability to actually adapt and build resilience to a rapidly changing climate. So we really need to start shifting our mindset away from viewing ocean protection, restoration, and sustainable management as being a nice to have. And we really need to start thinking about protecting our marine ecosystems as being central to securing national economies and also building resilience for business and society. And just finally, with that in mind, the marine protected areas that you mentioned earlier, in particular, are considered to be critical nature-based solution. They are part of the global biodiversity framework. There is a commitment now to have 30% of the ocean protected in some way, and they are proven to actually build resilience and actually enhance fisheries in many areas. So, you know, they are, as I say, a critical nature-based solution that we should be thinking about and we should be investing in and financing. And I guess the big question is, where is that finance going to come from? There's very little finance currently being invested into restoration, protection and sustainable management of the ocean, despite it contributing so significantly to the ocean economy. And so, and we know that climate finance is also sort of falling short of what's needed to deliver 1.5 degrees. So we know the GBF has a commitment to 200 billion to all ecosystems, not just oceans. So very keen to see how that's going to be rolled out. But ultimately, I think that the biggest gains that could be had are actually thinking about the redirection of mainstream finance away from unsustainable development pathways and now really focusing on moving that finance towards sustainable blue economy pathways. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Dennis.
Thanks so much, Louise. And I'll ask you a bit more about that in a second. But really great also how you highlighted, I think, the urgency of action that is needed in this space. And you've brilliantly shown how nature and climate really are, as we heard earlier on as well, two sides of the same coin. So I think it behooves us to act quickly. And so most of the financial actors that are attending this conference have been thinking about climate for the last, I hope, decades, but probably years. Let me move over to Roland and see what do you think, what lessons can be taken from that kind of climate approach to finance, that we can maybe leapfrog a bit of that process to have faster results in the nature space.
Sure. Thanks, Dennis. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to note that I've worn my most attention-grabbing tie for you today. I mean, it's near the end of the session. So the South Pole is a carbon asset developer. So a lot of my comments are going to come from the point of view of investing in nature-based projects to create a carbon credit as an asset. But I think a lot of the principles can apply more broadly. And so just some quick statistics here to just put context into investments into nature. It depends which metrics and which studies you want to look at, but globally, I think that finance invested into biodiversity and ecosystems, that investment amount is somewhere between 80 and about $220 billion, which sounds staggering, but Louise just said that the ocean could be valued at about 24 trillion, something like that. So of that investment of, let's say, the high level target of about 220 billion USD, about 80 to 90% of that is coming from public investments, grant facilities, development aid, etc. And then the remaining 10 to 20% is coming from private finance, of which carbon finance contributes about 1%, payment for ecosystem services, another 1%, and the remainder is coming from sustainably sourced commodities, like, let's say, FSC certified timber, fair trade agricultural commodities, etc. So actually, each of those different investment types has got a very different set of incentives and modalities. And if we want to look for innovative solutions, each of those cases, we probably need to look at what the gaps are or what the bottlenecks are in our, say, our traditional investment tools and our risk management systems. Another point that's been made a few different times today, I think, including in the loss and damage session earlier, is that if you look at a sector like agriculture or infrastructure, these are very well modeled from an actuarial sense. We understand the risks and the financial models behind that. But if you look at a nature-based investment, something at a landscape scale, it's an area we've got really very little historical data, and they're incredibly complex because we're exposed to governance risks and socioeconomic risks, natural disasters, uncertain climate, etc. So in the carbon markets, we, I suppose, need to think about tools that, firstly, that actually help us to de-risk an investment as much as possible before we embark on it. And secondly, we need some sort of insurance mechanism, let's say, to hedge against unfortunate outcomes or project failures. So at least as far as insurance mechanisms, one of the ways that that's addressed in carbon markets is through something that's known as a buffer discount, a buffer pool from every single project in the carbon markets. A certain proportion of those credits are discounted and set aside. They can never be traded, and they're placed into a buffer pool. The discount is going to be made depending on the risk perceived of that particular project, and that gets held as an insurance mechanism in case of, let's say, project failure or loss of a credit. Maybe your forest burns down. Something needs to be done to replace that credit. On the side of de-risking investments at that very early stage, so that we can actually now begin to invest in the kind of projects we all want to see, there are a few innovations and interesting tools newly available to us. And one thing that caught my eye was recently the launch of something called the ACMI, the African Carbon Markets Initiative. This was something which was funded by some private capital commitments at the last COP, and I think they raised something like $200 million, which is going to finance a number of readiness activities in 7 countries. So it's we've got 54 countries we need to account for. 7 countries is a good start here in Africa. But that will essentially provide a roadmap to investments in each of those countries. It might even be used to establish particular financial tools and methodologies that are going to fit that very specific context of Gabon or Kenya or Rwanda, etc., etc. Generically, some other mechanisms that we see on the horizon, increasingly a number of financial institutions and also development institutions are making available grants matching instruments or debt guarantee instruments. Essentially something that says, if I put in $1, you're going to put in the other. And that's really something which will help tease out some investors who might otherwise be very risk averse. And then lastly, we see some innovations happening in more a revolving fund kind of facility, something that's usually structured out of blended finance, maybe from development grants and also private capital. South Pole manages such a fund called the Landscape Resilience Fund. And this is something which has essentially got a very soft and flexible payback mechanism for projects which have particular criteria. Essentially, once that project has paid back its initial loan, that funding is then recycled and be used to subsidize another project. So these are some of the things that we see on the landscape, and undoubtedly some new toys to play with us in the near future.
Thanks so much for that, Roland. Appreciate also you throwing in some innovative solutions that you're already observing, which is great. And before I come to you, Kelvin, I'll just quickly jump back to Louise, because obviously in the ocean space things are a bit more tricky and a bit more out of sight, out of mind. So I want to ask you, how can financial institutions start, reduce their impact on the marine environment, and also crucially, what is the risk of inaction?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I've already talked a little bit about the fact that we are in an ocean biodiversity and climate crisis, and financial institutions with a growing stake in the ocean will have this sort of escalating exposure to these climate and ocean related risks. So WWF worked with Metabolics. We really wanted to assess this, and we undertook a sort of value at risk assessment and model and report, the Navigating Ocean Risk Report, to really quantify how financial risks arise cumulatively within the blue economy. And we found that 66% of listed companies have an exposure to ocean level risks. And under a business as usual scenario, we found that $8.4 trillion worth of assets and revenues were actually at risk potentially over the next 15 years due to declining ocean health and the effects of climate change. And I would say that was fairly conservative. But if we do take immediate action now to align with the Paris Agreement and to deliver the GBF, these losses could actually be reduced significantly, although not entirely at the 1.8 degree level that we did the analysis on. So most notably, coastal real estate was particularly at risk, and I've just done some recent reading which said that private sector financiers in the US market, so basically coastal real estate with exposure to sea level rise in the US market is actually now selling at a 7% discount. So put simply, there's basically too much mainstream finance being directed at unsustainable development, and there's very little finance being targeted, as I said earlier, at restoring, protecting and sustainably managing our oceans' natural resources. And really by taking the sort of decisions that significantly reduce environmental, social and financial risks and redirecting this capital towards sustainable development pathways, this can really significantly contribute to reversing the current climate and biodiversity crisis. So WWF worked with a number of other organisations, including UNEP, to develop, back in 2018, to develop the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Principles to really support the finance sector to make good decisions about where these investments and finance is going. It's actually the first global framework to guide finance and investments towards a sustainable blue economy, and these principles essentially foster cooperation and communication on everything from ocean health, scientific research to data collection and technical innovations, and they really sort of aim to encourage this multi-sector shift. They also aim to align with the Sustainable Development Goal for oceans, and in fact all of the Sustainable Development Goals, I would say, and they complement existing frameworks governing responsible investments, so the UNPRI and the Equator Principles. And they also obviously recognise the importance of compliance, of transparency and disclosure. And whilst they are voluntary at the moment, we think that widespread adoption could really transform future development trajectories in the ocean. They're now the guiding framework for UNEP-FI's Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Initiative, and there are 44 signatories to these principles, very large-scale FIs, and over 80 members on the actual platform. And this includes both public and private sector partners such as World Bank, EIB, Aviva Asset Managers, Bank of Qingdao, AXA Group and so forth. So very large companies and organisations representing around $11 trillion in terms of assets under management. And WWF has subsequently been working with UNEP to develop granular guidance for these principles, because they are a very overarching framework, And this is across 8 maritime sectors now. So that guidance is available for seafood, coastal and marine tourism, shipping, ports, marine renewable energy, natural infrastructure, and solid waste disposal. And the guidance goes into some detail about the risks associated with current practices. So these are physical, operational, market, regulatory and reputational risks. And it also outlines which activities and investments to avoid, which to really challenge, that need to be transitioned, and which to seek out. So we were talking about nature-based solutions earlier. And it really provides, very granular information. So I do recommend that you take the opportunity to review and look at these principles and these tables. And it's just probably important to say that we did have full involvement of the platform and the finance community in developing that granular guidance. So I think it is a very pragmatic set of guidance. I think I'll leave it at that because I know the time's running out.
Thanks so much, Louise. Yes, if you're interested in reading any of these resources, they're for free on our website. And I think one topic I'd like to highlight and draw from your points, Louise, is that for these new topics like biodiversity, nature, blue economy, it's really important to have collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration between scientists and other stakeholders, finance actors. And now to you, Kelvin, finally, you're involved in the African Natural Capital Alliance. Can you tell us a bit more about what's going on in this alliance? What is it for? What is your role?
Great. Thanks, Dennis. Good afternoon. So as Dennis was saying, nature is a fairly new topic, both globally and for African financial institutions. And so it would actually be interesting if we could do some sort of poll and for the financial institutions that are involved here in the room, just to understand where you are at in understanding nature and then starting to integrate it into your business. But for most institutions that are really early stage. And so the African Natural Capital Alliance is an African initiative to provide a practical means for you to move forward on this agenda, for you to start to develop finance solutions for nature and biodiversity. Maybe just to quickly pan out and with the why, the why is because Africa has this immense natural capital, but the way that we are developing as a continent economically is unsustainable in terms of our use of natural resources. So we're degrading nature far too fast. We've lost 30% of our forest cover in the last 20 years. We obviously cannot continue down that path and still retain rich natural capital. And the reason is that it's not priced into economic decision making. So when you're considering expanding agricultural production or you're building a new industry, the value of the forest or the wetland, whatever that you're going to do that on, is not properly taken into account. And so, the economic value of the enterprise is prioritized over the ecosystem services. And so we need to start to take into account those factors. And the finance sector has a very key role to play in that because they're advising clients, they're providing both debt and equity capital, providing risk management through insurance. And so the finance sector helps to direct the way that the economy moves. And so African Natural Capital Alliance is really African financial institutions coming together to say that we want to provide some leadership on this. We want to take action. And so it's a collaborative forum for peer learning, but also for taking action. And so we're doing a number of things for financial institutions where a lot of it is about capacity building. And a key means that we're using for that is the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. We're helping FIs to pilot that. And it's not only a disclosure framework, it's a very useful risk management framework for understanding kind of your exposure as a business to nature-related risks, understanding what the opportunities are, understanding where you're at, and then being able to take action. So it's a very useful framework. We're helping FIs to pilot that, and also to give feedback to the TNFD because it is a beta framework at the moment. Version 1.0 will be released New York Climate Week in September this year. And so it's an iterative process, and we're wanting to make sure that the African voice, the African context is taken into account in the framework. And so we're actively giving feedback to TNFD and really helping FIs to also then pilot nature-based solutions, finance solutions to actually get their balance sheet to be put towards this. And there's a number of different initiatives that they're focusing on. We're also doing work on the regulatory side because we recognize that not all FIs are going to take action on this agenda by themselves. And so there needs to be a regulatory push. We're helping regulators to think through how do they issue guidance to the market, like a roadmap. Like in 5 years' time, what do we expect in terms of maturity from you as a sector? What are some of the disclosure requirements we're going to introduce? How are we going to move towards disclosure? Just so there's clarity for the market. So that's what we're involved in. And what we're finding is that there's actually a lot of real engagement from the financial sector on this, real ownership of it, recognition that this is so important to our economies that we need to take action.
That's great to hear, actually. And if you guys are interested to learn more about the TNFD, there's a session tomorrow. Mark your calendars. I'm just going to ask you a very brief follow-on question before I jump back to Roland, and I think we have to ramp up after that. Within the African Natural Capital Alliance, what are some of the hurdles that the stakeholders are reporting in getting this as part of their agenda and getting this spread across their business lines? What are some of the main issues? Maybe the top three would be enough at this stage. But
okay, that's not so difficult. So we encounter these kind of every day. So the number one is you need to have leadership buy-in. So for the FIs where it's just the sustainability team or the risk management team trying to drive this, and it's not from the C-level or the CEO, it's very, very difficult. So you need your leadership to understand this is strategically important. I think second challenge is capacity, and so often you're dealing with really constrained sustainability teams that are still trying to get their heads around climate. You're now adding nature, which is far more complex, and so capacity is a serious issue, even for the biggest and the most advanced FIs in Africa. And actually, I think that's a global challenge. I think the third one to mention is data, and so because nature is very location specific, and because FIs have not previously collected this data, because if you want to access kind of satellite proprietary data, it's very expensive. You often need to use proxies, and so actually being able to properly identify within your portfolio what your exposures and opportunities are without the exact right data is sometimes challenging. So I think those are the top three.
Thanks so much. I don't want to finish on the problems necessarily, and one of the kind of solution ideas there has been a buzzword that the last couple of months was biodiversity credits. I know it's very early stage, but I know the South Pole are involved in some of their early work. So Roland, maybe do you think what kind of role can biodiversity credits play in this space? And if I may ask briefly, so we can be on time. Thank you.
What's brief in your words?
A couple of minutes is all right.
Okay. So exactly as you say, the potential of biodiversity credits is very exciting, but it's still a puppy. I think it's still at the beard stroking stage in some ways. But where it provides some really interesting solutions, again coming from a carbon perspective, carbon credits are always going to prioritize high carbon ecosystems, so big rainforests, but that means that we are lacking ways to invest in other really precious ecosystems that might exist in an arid environment where you have small succulent plants. The issues that we still need to get our head around is how to measure it and how to put a fair value on it. Because if you can imagine a carbon credit is something which can actually be quantified, you can literally weigh it, and it is a universally used unit. But when we come to trying to measure and put a value on a piece of biodiversity, we're faced with this quandary of how do you decide a fair value for a wetland versus a rhinoceros versus rare orchids. They all have intrinsic value, but they don't have any units of comparison between them. So the way we see the scope for biodiversity offsetting unfolding, I suppose, is going to be in at least two ways. And the first is what we kind of dryly call a compliance market. And that would be something that would probably exist in a domestic policy, in other words, a country-specific policy, and this would be something which allows one to offset your environmental impact in one location by investing in a comparable ecosystem somewhere else. So think about a circumstance where maybe we inevitably have to clear some lands to create a road or to build a dam. That concept would allow one to offset one's impact, the damage in one location. You must now direct your investments to an equivalent ecosystem somewhere else. We do also see the possibility that a voluntary biodiversity market will unfold in the same way as a carbon market has. And increasingly, I think we've got a lot of very cool technological tools at our disposal we can start using to be able to monitor those impacts. And by way of example, you think of how to monitor a coral reef or a meadow of seagrasses. It's a very complex thing to send divers out there to go and do a count. So we might now be able to use things like underwater microphones, where, you know, a healthy coral reef is noisy and a dead reef is quiet. We might be able to use the technology of eDNA, which means actually sampling for diversity of DNA in a river, in a pond, a stream, and we can start to track actually a positive nature outcome. So I think it's a buzzword now, and you're going to hear a lot of it.
Yes.
It's going to take a while to get it right, though.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting some of these conversations that are ongoing. And I think also one of the big topics is whether biodiversity offsetting can even be a thing, because, you know, there might not be an equivalence for certain ecosystems. And these conversations are ongoing right now. And so definitely watch this space. I know we are running very short of time, but before I wrap up with one last question for each of the panelists, I just want to see if there are any questions in the audience. I think we probably have time for one brief one, if there's any. There's someone here.
Hello, my name is Simon Pfluger. I'm from Climate and Company. We are a Berlin-based sustainable finance think tank. I actually have a question first for Kelvin. Are you aware of any existing biodiversity disclosure frameworks of African nations already? As we see that there's some developments, especially in taxonomies already. And then also for Roland, speaking about biodiversity credits, you just spoke about the compliance market. How do you think that would work? Because usually the financing countries would probably be the Annex 1 countries, and they have less biodiversity to harm. So would there be enough incentive to then finance the huge biodiversity that you would have here? Or would you actually need to put the compliance markets in African nations? Because there's actually a lot more to harm. What are your takes on that? Thank you.
Okay, Kelvin, maybe you kick off and then.
Yeah, great. So we are, so obviously there was 188 countries that signed the Global Biodiversity Framework, including all the African countries. And so there is definitely interest from the governments to figure out how they're going to do this. So National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans in BSAPs are something that they're looking at. And for some of them, kind of developing taxonomies is one of the first steps. And so in South Africa, for example, biodiversity is very much included in the taxonomy that's just been developed. And they're also looking at, as well as developing these strategy and action plans, how they can finance them. So basically biodiversity finance plans, but they're all pretty much in the very early stage. So, as a development organization, we're supporting some of them, and UNDP is also doing a fair amount of work in that space. But I would say most of them are starting from 0 to 5%, and going to, in order to hit the 2030 target, are going to have to go really fast.
Roland, maybe, yeah, sure.
Simon, thanks. Really interesting question. But, I said earlier that this is still the beard stroking phase. So this is definitely something that I think is going to be threshed out at a lot of academic forums. The way I see a compliance market working is more likely going to be on a strictly domestic basis, where, let's say, an action inside Namibia would in some way be compensated by a positive investment in that same country. I think your point that it would be very difficult to see how it works is let's say a country to country transfer, but all things are possible, I suppose. But let me digest that a little bit. All right.
Super. Thanks so much. And I have one last question for each of you. You've got 1 minute each. No pressure. What recommendation would you give a financial institution that wants to take the first steps in this space? What would be your one piece of advice? Maybe you can start with Louise, and Roland, then Kelvin.
Thanks very much. So a systemic shift is really going to come from FIs requesting full transparency right across supply chains, encouraging and supporting these transitions that are going to be required to move towards a sustainable blue economy, and really challenging and ceasing to finance where there is a continued failure to mitigate environmental and social risks. And I think the sustainable blue economy finance principles and the guidance can really support you in making those decisions and really sort of interrogating where you see that there might be what might be some of these failures, and really supporting this systemic shift, as I say. Thank you.
From my side, I would say, I think that the message we'd always try to put across, that any investment or action that we defer is only going to be more costly later. So I think for any institution looking to invest in the space, I think it's necessary to do a reconciliation, understand exactly what one is exposed to and the risks inherent, and to perhaps consider, put one's toes in the water slowly, try a pilot, try a little bit of a feasibility before rolling out. But I think we'll have the strong sense that not acting will be far more expensive than whatever you choose to do right now.
Great. So through the African Natural Capital Alliance, this is our kind of core value propositions. This is what we do on a regular basis with FIs. And so we have a process that we help them walk through. It starts with kind of understanding nature. So Nature 101, what are the various taxonomies, what are the various tools and frameworks that are available so that you understand. Second phase is nature heat map. So understanding across your portfolio, what are the physical risks, what are the transition risks in the different sectors, your different lending, investment, equity. And that gives you just a very simple diagrammatic heat map of high, low, medium risk across your portfolio. And from there, we do a capability assessment on all the different aspects that are required to kind of integrate nature into your business, on strategy, on governance, on targets and metrics, on disclosure. And so get a baseline of where you are as an organization, and then set targets for how, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, where do you want to be and how you're going to work to integrate those things going forward. And that approach, I think, has been working well.
Right, thank you. So if I may summarize these recommendations, that understand nature first, then act now rather than later. It will be cheaper to move now. And the last point might be that there are tools available to use now, tomorrow. So seek them out. And with that, it's my pleasure to close this session. Thanks very much to the speakers. Thanks very much to the audience. I hope you learned a lot. And obviously, if there are more questions, feel free to seek us out after the session as well. And enjoy the gala dinner. Thank you.